Thank you all for coming out tonight. So this is our semester. We do two lectures a year with the Morton-Kenney. This is our spring Morton-Kenney lecture. Just want to thank everyone for coming. Recognize just a couple people real quick. John Shaw, who is director of the Public Policy Institute, and very happy to announce Victoria Geitz. Yeah, I got it right. Who's the new associate director, which is great for John's health. It's great for the institute, peace of mind, everything. So it's great that he has the support that really the institute needs, and great to have her here. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I had a student come up to me last week and had been looking at the lecture and looked up Barbara Walter, and she's from UCSD, and looked her up. And to quote the student, she's kind of a badass. And she's right. And so we're really happy to have Barbara here. She's an expert on civil wars. She's going to talk broadly about the rise of civil wars and where we're at worldwide. But she does some really interesting work on just connecting. The thing is about civil wars is that I don't have to convince you that this is an important topic, right? War, peace, civil war, terrorism. I have to convince people of stuff I do is important, but not this. But she's really good at what she does and kind of putting those all together and does some fascinating research in it. If you're interested in reading some of her stuff, she has won awards not only for her and grants for her straight academic peer-reviewed work, but as a blogger as well, and want to make political violence at a glance. And so it's listed on there, on the bio that we handed out. But if you're interested at all in what she's doing, that's a great way to keep track of what she's up to. So without further ado, I want to welcome Barbara Walter.
Excellent. Yay, we're going old school. My name is Barbara Walter. I'm a political scientist. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday night. When I got this invitation, I was very honored to get this invitation. I was especially pleased because I was told I could talk about anything I wanted. And that's a very dangerous thing if you knew me better. But thankfully, Tobin didn't know me very well, and he gave me this gift. And so I decided that I'm going to talk about some of these really interesting big trends that we're seeing emerging in civil wars. And these trends have been emerging relatively recently, since the early 2000s. I have to apologize, I've had a terrible cold, and it's just going to cough every now and then. I'm going to start with a story. So this is a photograph of the leadership of Central Command, CENTCOM, in December of 2015. CENTCOM is the arm of the U.S. military that's in charge of all military operations that occur in North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. So for those of you who know the countries in those regions, these are the guys that are in charge of U.S. military intervention in Libya, Yemen, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I'm a badass. These guys are really badasses. The man in the middle was the head of U.S. Central Command, Lloyd Austin, until April of 2016, when he retired, and the man to his left, Joseph Votan, became the new commander. Now, some of you may have heard of Joseph Votan. He was in the news this past February because he heavily criticized, he actually broke ranks with Donald Trump when Donald Trump made the surprising announcement in February that the United States was going to withdraw all of its soldiers from Syria. This made him very angry. He was very public about his anger, and to many of us' surprise, he is still commander, so he was not fired as a result. Now, in some respects, that wasn't that surprising. I think Trump would have had a very hard time finding somebody in Central Command who didn't agree with Votan, and so he could have replaced him with somebody else who would have been equally critical of that decision. Now, I'm starting with this because in December of 2015, I got an email from General Austin's assistant. I was sitting in my office in San Diego. This email comes in, and the email asked if I would like to come to the headquarters of Central Command in Tampa, Florida, 2 weeks from there then, to have a meeting. And the meeting was called the Central Region, 2016 and beyond. If I agreed to come to this meeting, they had a series of questions related to Iran and Israel, the Persian Gulf, China, and Europe that they would like me to prepare and answer for them. And of course I said yes. I was absolutely thrilled. 2 weeks later, I got on a plane, I flew to Tampa, and they had invited me to a preliminary dinner that evening before we had our main conference the next day. They did not tell me it would be a dinner, they didn't tell me what the purpose of the dinner was. It was at Eddie V's Steakhouse on the outskirts of Tampa. I went there from the airport. They ushered me into this private room. I walked into the private room, and every single high-ranking member of CENTCOM, and there were about 25 of them, was in the room, including Generals Austin and Votel. So I thought, this is quite interesting. There were also 2 other academics in the room. They were both Middle Eastern experts. So it was very pleasant. We made a lot of small talk. We ate steak. We drank a lot of good wine. And I thought, oh, this is a very nice introduction before we have the meeting tomorrow. And then as dessert was being served, General Austin, who's about 6'6", and he's a very imposing guy, sat up and he said very slowly, he said, I have a question for the academics in the room. Tomorrow we're going to be in a very public setting, and we're not going to be able to talk as openly as we will tonight. And so I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer this question honestly. I want you to be honest. And this was his question. What are we currently not thinking about in the Middle East that we should be thinking about? And I thought, oh, this is so awesome. I have tenure, and I raised my hand. And he said, yes. And so my answer was pretty simple. I started by saying that I thought that the policy that the U.S. was pursuing in the Middle East was wrong. I said that I thought their policy of concentrating almost exclusively on trying to, what they call, destroy what's the word? It's 2 Ds. They like to alliterate. Let's just say destroy and deteriorate ISIS.
Degrade?
What was it?
Degrade?
Destroy and degrade ISIS was bound to fail. And it was bound to fail because it was not addressing any of the underlying issues that was allowing ISIS to emerge in the first place. So the issue that they were not thinking about, that they should be thinking about, was how to end the civil wars that had allowed violent extremist groups like ISIS to emerge and then to thrive. So the room then went silent. And General Austin looked at me and he said, go on. And so one of the reasons I was saying this wasn't because I was being cheeky. It is because I knew that General Austin probably knew exactly what I was going to say. And I think he probably staged this in order for me to say exactly what he thought I was going to say. Because people who get to the position that Boyd Austin had gotten get there because they're very smart and they're very savvy. And my guess was that he had a very, very particular point that he wanted to make to the audience at that table, more so than the audience the next day. And he needed somebody outside of the military who was perceived to be objective and could bring in a lot of data and a lot of history to make that point for him. So on the one hand, it may appear as if I was being particularly courageous, but in reality, my guess is I was not. I was doing exactly what he hoped I would do, and I could do this anyway, he very graciously says, go on. And I said, over the last 20, 25 years, there's been an enormous amount of really high-quality research on both civil wars and on violent extremist groups. And we now know with a fair degree of certainty, you could loosely call them, this is social science, loosely call them facts, or at least robust relationships. And there's 5 of those relationships that apply to what's going on in the Middle East. And I just want to tell you about that. So I'm going to use my time telling you about that. The first relationship that we have a fair amount of confidence in is that civil war drives terrorism. Terrorism doesn't drive civil war. Terrorism or violent extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they may emerge outside of civil wars, but they don't end up becoming the powerful transnational organizations that they have become in the absence of what some people call gray zones, in the absence of anarchic situations, in the absence of countries that are weak and basically unable to root them out. So if you look, for example, at the history of Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda was essentially formed by Saudi citizens. But Al-Qaeda itself as an organization was never able to gain a foothold in Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda only really began to grow after the civil war in Afghanistan broke out. The United States went in there after 9/11 in 2001. Al-Qaeda then, Osama bin Laden moved the organization to Afghanistan, to that very peripheral region along the border of Pakistan where there is essentially the absence of a state. And that's where Al-Qaeda, under Osama bin Laden's leadership, was able to grow and thrive. If you then look what happened after that, once the civil war broke out in Iraq in 2003, Al-Qaeda then moved partly into Iraq. It was never able to gain a presence under Saddam Hussein, and it was only after that country began to destabilize that Al-Qaeda moved into there. If you then look at the origin of ISIS, ISIS broke off from Al-Qaeda Iraq. And it broke off in early 2011. The timing is not a coincidence. The leaders of ISIS walked away from Al-Qaeda and formed their own organization only after the civil war broke out in Syria, in neighboring Syria in 2011. That's when that small group of particularly radical Al-Qaeda members moved into Syria, and ISIS really gained strength only because it was able to operate with relative impunity in Syria because of its civil war. So there's this correlation between very weak states that don't have the state capacity, either the political will or the political capacity to direct their resources to try to root out these violent extremist groups, and the growth, the expansion, the strength of these groups. So that's the first thing that we know. So if you're worried about ISIS, right, and you don't pay attention to the civil wars, you can eliminate ISIS, right, which the United States looks like it's just about to do in Syria and Iraq. You can eliminate ISIS. You can raise your hands and be very excited and say, we won, we won, we won. But as long as the underlying conditions that gave rise to ISIS still exist, and ISIS 2.0 will simply emerge in its place. And in fact, we haven't eliminated ISIS, because all it's done is its leadership has moved into other countries that are experiencing civil war, and the new place that they've moved into are African countries that are destabilizing, in particular the countries around the Lake Chad Basin. So Nigeria, Boko Haram has already been operating there. Boko Haram essentially has become a franchise of ISIS. You have Mali, you have Chad. So ISIS is kind of like an organism that sort of moves to areas where where it knows it can operate unencumbered by state repression. The second thing that we know is that civil wars have actually been increasing over time. So this is a figure, light blue shows you the number of civil wars from 1946 to 2016. The yellow is the number of interstate wars. That's actually quite interesting. Many people often think that interstate wars are quite a big problem. They've actually declined over time to the point where they have been almost non-existent for decades. The dark blue are anti-colonial wars. Those disappeared with the end of colonialism. That is not the case with civil wars. It is, first, by far the most dominant form of violence, political violence in the world today. Second, it rose fairly consistently after World War II, peaking at about 1992. One of the big surprises was the incidence of civil war radically reversed during the 1990s. That was largely due to the fact that more civil wars were ending than were beginning. So if you think about the 1990s, it was actually this very exciting time when you suddenly had lots of negotiated settlements to long-standing civil wars. So you had negotiated settlements in Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, Cambodia, Mozambique, Bosnia. So there were still civil wars that were starting at this time. It's just that there were many more that were ending. Now, during this time, people were really hopeful. And there were articles written about, where we've seen the end of civil wars. And unfortunately, that trend has reversed itself again. Starting in about 2001 or 2003, we now have seen more civil wars starting again than ending. This goes to 2016. If you were to extend it through 2018, 2017 and 2018 were two of the most violent years, so that is continuing to move up. This is not indicative of a downward trend, so we're probably somewhere up here. So civil wars are a problem. They're an increasing problem. And one of the things that makes them particularly problematic is that once they start, they are very difficult to end. And of course, many people think the Syrian civil war is a particularly troubling civil war. It is. It is a particularly bloody war. It's created an unusually high number of refugees. It is, by Civil War standards, though, a relatively young civil war. The average civil war during this time period is about 10 years. The Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011, hasn't even reached that mark. So it's below average in terms of duration. That suggests that we still have probably many more years of many of the civil wars that are taking place currently. So the third thing that we know is that these post-2003 civil wars have broken out predominantly in Muslim-majority countries. So what this map shows, the green indicates countries whose plus 50% of their population is Muslim. The stars indicate major civil wars. So this is Libya, this is Yemen, this is Pakistan, Afghanistan, this is Iraq, this is Syria, this is Palestine, which is considered, in this particular data set, Palestine is considered. This is Nigeria, this is South Sudan. The two real outliers are Ukraine, has a negligible Muslim population, and the Congo, which is also doesn't have a particularly large Muslim population. So one of the really puzzling features of these new civil wars is that they are happening in a particular type of country. One of the things that many people have begun to argue, or one of the assumptions they're beginning to make, is because these civil wars are breaking out in Muslim-majority countries, there must be something specific to Muslims or to Islam that's driving these civil wars. And one of the things I'm going to reveal to you today is that these wars are no different than the wars that we've seen over the last 70 years. The conditions that gave rise to wars in these countries are the exact same conditions, for the most part, that have given rise to wars in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, Eastern Europe. It's just, what's interesting about these wars is that they're happening now in this region. I'm going to talk about why I think that's the case. The fourth pattern that we're seeing is that we're seeing more and more Islamist groups fighting these wars, and in particular, a radical type of Islamist group, Salafi jihadist groups. So what this figure indicates, the blue is the percent of all civil wars that are in Muslim countries, again, since the end of World War II, up until fairly recently. And the green is the percent of Islamist insurgents that are fighting these wars. And one of the really interesting things about this graph is that we had civil wars in Muslim-majority countries, but we didn't have these Salafi jihadist groups fighting them. Until the 1970s, it was, I guess somewhat flat. And then starting in the late 1990s, it really began to increase and continues to increase. So there does appear to be something that's either driving these types of rebel groups to go to the ideological extreme, or there's something that's incentivizing rebel groups to go to the ideological extreme. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think might be driving that. The last pattern that we now know exists is what some people call the contagion effect. One of the best predictors of whether a civil war breaks out is whether a country borders another country that is currently experiencing a civil war. And there's been really interesting research by people like Christian Gleditsch and Aidian Salahin about why contagion, why these spillover effects occur. And one of the things that they have found is that it appears to be driven by large refugee movements. Now, it's not that refugees move into another country and the refugees start the war. So it's not that the refugees are bad per se. It's that if you move large amounts of people and they are temporarily housed in neighboring countries, oftentimes those neighboring countries were not particularly strong to begin with. They tended to be poor themselves. Oftentimes they'll have their own ethnic problems, or they'll have governments that are weak. It's that large refugee movements are destabilizing for a variety of reasons. This is a map from 2015, and you can't read it, but I'll talk you through it. But in 2015, Turkey had almost 2 million Syrian refugees. 2 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon at the time had 1.1 million Syrian refugees. There's only 6 million people in Lebanon. Think about that. This is an enormous, and Lebanon is a country that has had a civil war in the past. It was, until relatively recently, basically a proxy state for Syria. It is not a strong government, and they've had to absorb a very large percentage of the refugees. Jordan, in 2015, had almost 630,000 refugees. Today it has 1.5 million. Jordan, again, not a particularly strong country. It has a little less than 10 million people itself. It's holding a lot of refugees as well. Egypt has quite a lot. Iraq has 250,000. And so you can see that, these refugees are moving into areas that are barely holding it together. And so it's no surprise that bordering a state that's experiencing its own civil war tends to increase your risk factor of experiencing one yourself. So all of this research, the fact that civil wars are a breeding ground for violent extremist groups. The fact that civil wars are increasing over time, they're not going away. The fact that Muslim countries are particularly affected, radical Islamists are growing, so it's not just ISIS and Al-Qaeda. If you look at Iraq, for example, you'll see multiple additional Salafi jihadist groups that fought that war, and the same in Syria. So ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not the only games in town. All of this research suggests that our focus on ISIS to the exclusion of this much larger problem is not going to solve anything. So I'm going to say it publicly, I'm going to say even if we eradicate ISIS entirely from the Middle East, ISIS is not going to be defeated. It will come back. And of course that's going to be especially a problem if the United States withdraws from those regions, allowing those wars probably to continue longer than they otherwise would. Certainly taking the pressure off. We were the main group that was targeting ISIS. ISIS is simply going to move back in. So I don't even think an ISIS 2.0 is going to emerge in place of ISIS. I think the original ISIS is simply going to come back. Okay, so that's what I said. And the floor was open to discussion, which was really interesting. I didn't know what people were going to ask me. Lloyd Austin was quite quiet during this time. He sort of let other people in the room ask their questions. And not surprisingly, the audience really gravitated towards three questions. The first question was, okay, why are all these wars happening in Muslim countries, right? And it's hard not to believe that it's something related to Islam, especially when you see the rise of these radical Islamist groups that's happening at the same time. And what I said to them is what I just said to you. If you look historically, if you look at the conditions that have been present in many past civil wars, they are all present in many of these countries. So if you were to ask me prior to the Arab Spring, what countries are most at risk of civil war, I would have pointed to Libya. I would have pointed to Syria. I would have pointed to Saudi Arabia as well. So not all of them have experienced civil wars yet, but they have all of the conditions that people who study civil war know increase the risk of civil war. And this is how I explained it to them. The existing research shows that for civil wars to break out, you need three conditions. The first is pretty obvious: grievances, right? People have to have a motive to rebel. They have to be sufficiently dissatisfied with the status quo to be willing to organize a rebellion, put their lives on the line, fight the government. And we actually have a fairly good idea about what grievances are particularly salient. There's political grievances and there's economic grievances. There's really, really great, fairly recent research by three researchers: Lars Erik Cederman, his co-author Wimmer, I don't remember what his first name is, and Min. So Cederman, Wimmer, and Min. And they've done a whole series of studies trying to explain which ethnic group will rebel. So about 56% of civil wars break down along ethnic lines. But almost every country in the world is multi-ethnic. There are thousands of ethnic groups in the world. The vast majority of them never rebel. So Cederman, Wimmer, and Min wanted to figure out, okay, which are the ones that rebel and what causes them to rebel? And their theory was that it's ethnic groups that are politically excluded from government. And even more important, it's ethnic groups that are politically excluded from government who had once been in power but had lost that power. Those are the ones that have the greatest motive to rebel. And they did all sorts of, they collected a whole series of data, they ran lots of regressions, and lo and behold, yes, that's true. It's a very, very robust relationship. So if you're an ethnic group and you used to have power but you've lost power, you tend to rebel. This is exactly what happened in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a member of the Sunni group, right? Sunnis were a minority in Iraq. He ruled for decades. He ruled to the exclusion of the Shia majority. He was quite brutal and repressive. When the United States went in 2003 and deposed Saddam Hussein and basically disassembled the Ba'ath, the Sunni military, this created an opportunity for the Shia, the majority Shia, to gain control of the government. They were supposed to hold elections and share power with the Sunnis. They chose not to do that. So here you have the Sunnis. They had previously been in power, and now they know that they're going to probably be permanently excluded from power. And starting in 2006, they began to organize and rebel. And the civil war in Iraq was because you had a fairly large group, the Sunnis, who understood that the only way that they would have a chance of political power would be if they rebelled. The second factor that we know is influential is what's called bad governance, which is this vague, fuzzy term. But it really encompasses governments that rule to the detriment of their citizens. So you have no rule of law, you have no popular participation in government, you have heavy levels of corruption. So when you think about governments that you would not want to live under, that comes under this category. Those citizens tend to repel at higher rates than citizens who live under governments that they're quite pleased with. Again, that's not particularly surprising. If we were to look at some of the economic factors, GDP per capita has been found to be strongly associated with the outbreak of civil war, so poverty seems to be associated with it. The reason I don't have it up here is when you include measures of governance, GDP tends to drop out of significance. So these really are the two big important factors that create grievances over which people are willing to rebel. But there's lots of people around the world who live under terrible governments, and there are lots of people around the world who are, lots of groups that are excluded from power, and they never rebel. So this might be a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. So this kind of takes us to the second important factor. The countries that experience civil war are countries where it is also relatively easy for these excluded groups and these unhappy groups to mobilize support. And the way I think about it is, really, in order to have any chance to get a rebellion, an insurgency off the ground, you have to be able to recruit soldiers. So there have to be members of the local population that are willing to support you. You have to be able to obtain financing, money to buy guns and to supply these soldiers. And you have to be facing a government that is not particularly effective at repressing dissent. If you have a government with a really incredible surveillance and repressive arm, you might want to try to organize, but you're going to be immediately squelched. It's one of the reasons why we've never seen, or we haven't at least since the 1940s, seen a civil war in China. China's government has been incredibly effective at repressing any form of dissent, and they invest an enormous amount of resources in making sure that even if you are unhappy with the government, you will have no ability to organize. So you need the opportunity to be able to rebel. But again, all of us can think of examples where a country has lots of disaffected groups, where the government is actually not particularly strong, is weak, and yet you also do not get civil war. Think about the Arab Spring. Almost every single country in North Africa and the Middle East experienced popular demonstrations, mass demonstrations, right? So we know that every single one of these countries had disaffected citizens. They had citizens with grievances. We knew that they had the ability to organize. They were actually able to form mass protests, mass demonstrations. The government was either unwilling or unable to eliminate them. And yet, only 3 of those cases experienced civil war: Libya, Syria, and Yemen. The majority of Arab Spring countries never experienced civil war. And I would argue because they didn't have this third condition, or they had this third condition. Think about it this way. If you're a leader in power, let's say you're a dictator, and you know that you are not particularly popular, you know exactly who the groups are there who are deeply dissatisfied, who have incentives to mobilize. You also know if you are in a period of time when you are weak, right? And of course, every single dictator during the Arab Spring, facing mass protests in their capital cities, knew that they were in a moment of time when they were weak. They were weak. And worse than that, they knew that their citizens now knew that they were weak. Because the citizens were observing all of this dissatisfaction. They were observing that the military was doing nothing to stop the protesters. So they knew that they were in a moment when the first 2 necessary conditions for civil wars existed. If you are a dictator under those circumstances, you can avoid war by making the concessions necessary for peace. Right? And it seems kind of obvious. If your citizens are unhappy, if you give them enough concessions to allay their dissatisfaction, they will go home. And that's what happened in Tunisia, and that's what happened in Egypt, and that's what happened in Saudi Arabia, and that's what happened in Bahrain. They happened for different reasons. In Tunisia, President Ben Ali, he would have liked to stay in power, but when it became clear that he could not repress the protesters, he couldn't stop the protesters, he stepped down. That is a concession. He left power and was replaced by somebody else. Mubarak clearly wanted to stay in power. He wanted to stay in power so much that he gave his generals the order to shoot at the demonstrators in Tahrir Square. When his generals refused, he then understood that he had no power left. And what did he do? He stepped down. He was replaced. Now, there was a military coup later. The Muslim Brotherhood came into power. The Muslim Brotherhood has a fair amount of popular support in Egypt. The military allowed them to do that for a period of time, then launched a coup and essentially reinserted themselves in power. But civil war was avoided because Egyptians believed that they were getting at least one concession that they wanted, which was for Mubarak to leave. Saudi Arabia was a slightly different case, but a really interesting case. The House of Saud made absolutely no concessions to the protesters. They didn't have to make political concessions. Why? Because they have a lot of money. And so one of the ways that the House of Saud buys quiescence, compliance from its population, it's not a particularly popular regime, right? We know that there is unrest there. We know that it is the most authoritarian regime in the world. Its citizens don't rebel because they're essentially paid off with cash. They get stipends. And the stipends are really a money for peace deal. So if you have lots of money and your citizens who are subsidized are getting a stipend, begin to rebel, what does that tell you? The stipend is not high enough. That's what it tells you. And you give them more money. You give them what you believe or what you will learn is enough money to get them to go home. And that's exactly what they did. So the cases where you didn't get civil war, that had the first two conditions were the ones where the government eventually made economic or political concessions. The ones where you had civil war, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, are the cases where the leader had the first two conditions and made absolutely no concessions. So that's a really interesting puzzle. Why would Assad, facing these two threatening conditions, make no concessions? First, Syria doesn't have a lot of oil. He did not have the money to pay off his pirates. I think if he had the money, if he had had the oil wealth of the Persian Gulf states, I think he would have done that. But he didn't have that option. So the only option he had was the political option. He could step down from power. He could allow for elections to make a more representative government. And he chose not to do that. Why? He chose not to open up the government to be more representative because he comes from a very, very small minority group, right? If he allows political representation to be determined through elections, with 100% certainty he will lose. He doesn't have the numbers. If he allows some other form where he gives the vast Sunni majority in Syria, let's say 60% representation. They deserve a whole lot more, but let's say he gives them 60% representation. He knows that they will, at the first chance, get rid of him. And they have the numbers to get rid of him. Why didn't he leave? Why didn't he go into exile? I think maybe 30 years ago he would have gone into exile, like Somoza did, like Marcos did, like many of these hated dictators did in the past, where they set up villas in the south of France or in Florida or in Hawaii. But something's happened in the interim. The International Criminal Court instituted what's called the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute allows the United Nations to prosecute individuals, leaders of countries, for war crimes and a number of other things. And Assad understood that if he, first of all, he couldn't go many places into exile because the vast majority of countries have signed on to the Rome Statute, meaning that if the UN went after Assad, they would have to deliver Assad to him. Now, there's a few countries that haven't signed on to the Rome Statute. Zimbabwe is one of them. But they don't tend to be particularly stable countries, and they're not really attractive places to live. So he could go to Zimbabwe, but Mugabe was in his 90s, was probably not going to be in power very long. He didn't know who was going to replace Mugabe, and his successor could deliver him to the United Nations. So Assad, coming from a very, very small minority regime, deeply unpopular, didn't have an exit option, and basically knew that as soon as he opened up the government, the very large majority, which was very angry with him, could easily throw him into jail permanently and could potentially even kill him. That is what happened to Saddam Hussein. That's what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. It was not inconceivable that it could happen to Assad as well. So, again, if you think about the countries in the Middle East, starting in the early 2000s, they have all of these conditions. The Sunni majority the Sunnis are excluded from power in Iraq. They were a minority in Iraq. They've been excluded from power in Syria, where they're a large majority. There is bad governance throughout the region. In fact, the most authoritarian and the most repressive governments in the world are in the Middle East and Central Asia. So if you know that people tend to rebel in countries with terrible governments, and you were to ask, where do you think they're going to happen? They're going to happen in these two regions, which have the world's worst governments. Now you could ask yourself, well, why does the Middle East and Central Asia have so many really bad governments? And my answer to that is not because Muslims live there. It's because these poor people were cursed with large reserves of oil. Oil. And because they have oil, outside states have had a vested interest in basically creating very strong dependencies by their governments on countries like the United States. And the United States has a very strong interest in not opening up these countries to democratic elections, in part because they don't know who's going to be elected, and uncertainty is bad if what you really want is stability and control. And because Muslim citizens, a majority of Muslim citizens prefer democracy, but they prefer religious parties in power. They will vote religious parties into power, and the United States has been notoriously nervous about this. It's why Obama went from supporting elections in Egypt that brought into power the Muslim Brotherhood to basically reversing its policy and essentially supporting the military coup that then deposed them. There was too much uncertainty in the eyes of the United States, because what the United States really cares about is a consistent, cheap source of oil. And so you have particularly bad governments in places that tend to have lots of oil, because what becomes more important than democracy is a guaranteed source of oil. So politically it had all the conditions. And then if you look at the ability to organize, starting in 2010, you started to have food shortages. So you remember that poor vegetable vendor who started the Arab Spring in Tunisia. He set himself on fire. He was doing that to protest food prices, essentially. And again, if you think about what's going to incentivize people to rebel, to join rebel groups, to be willing to die in order to change the status quo, if you're looking at the prospect of potentially starving, your opportunity costs for becoming a soldier are not particularly high. So that was happening at the time. You also have incredibly high rates of unemployment. Egypt had some of the highest rates of unemployment, they still do. You also had a youth bulge where a high percentage of the population in many of these countries was between the age of 18 and 25, which is the demographic that is more likely to rebel. Countries that have a majority of senior citizens don't tend to have lots of civil wars. If you look at the financing aspect, one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda and ISIS were able to thrive was because you had wealthy Persian Gulf countries and wealthy individuals in the Persian Gulf who were funneling money to not only Islamist groups, but they were funneling money particularly into the hands of Salafi jihadist groups. So there was a source of external wealth if you wanted to organize, if the Sunnis wanted to organize. The Sunnis had an external source of financing, and most of that was coming from the Persian Gulf. If the Saudis got involved by supporting a group, the Iranians almost always wanted to counter, because there's a regional power battle going on between these two groups. The Iranians were supporting a particular group, the Saudis came in to counter them. So you had this regional dynamic playing out that was helping to finance groups. And then, starting in the early 2000s, it started to be revealed that these governments, these countries, these dictators that people had previously thought were absolutely they were incredibly strong. They were suddenly revealed to be very weak. It first happened in 2003. Saddam Hussein, he'd been in power for decades. He had faced popular rebellions within Iraq. He had brutally squelched them all. Suddenly, 2003 comes in, the United States eliminates him. Boom, he's gone. He's replaced by a Shia-led government, but it's very weak. And the military apparatus of Iraq has been dismantled. So you have a new government in power with essentially no military underpinning. That creates an opportunity for rebellion. And then if you look at the Arab Spring states, again, I think part of what allowed Gaddafi, for example, to survive as long as he did was fear. He had convinced his population that he could not be toppled. And yet suddenly you had this wellspring of popular protest, indicating that he was deeply unpopular. In Libya, you actually had NATO intervention, which got rid of him. And so suddenly, citizens across these regions knew if they were going to act, this was a particularly good time to act. And then concessions, I talked about that earlier. It was the governments that made concessions that avoided war. Those that did not. And they had very good practical reasons for not making concessions. So again, I told this entire story about why civil wars broke out in some Muslim countries, why civil wars didn't break out in other Muslim countries, without talking about religion at all. And it's because these countries fit almost perfectly the patterns that we have seen in other regions around the world over the last 70 years. Okay, so the second big question I got was, why did so many Islamist groups, especially these very radical groups, emerge? This answer is trickier. Studies have not yet been done to answer this question, so I'm going to give you my hunch, my theory. Again, one of the things that people have argued, usually it's newspaper accounts, if they hear about this trend, the assumption is, well, your average Muslim has become more radical. And surveys are not bearing this out. So the Pew Research Institute conducts surveys all the time. They've done consistently surveyed Muslims around the world. Let's see, where am I? They've consistently done surveys around the world. Probably one of the best known one was this huge survey. It was 38,000 Muslims in 39 countries, and they asked them a whole series of questions about their support for democracy, their attitudes towards ISIS, and what they found was that a majority of Muslims prefer democracy to any other type of government, that clear majorities do not support violence in the name of Islam, so they do not support jihad, and extraordinarily large majorities show disapproval for ISIS. So ISIS is not particularly popular, and these numbers have not changed significantly over time. So it does not appear, maybe there's been some shift. It has not been a dramatic shift. It is not a shift that is large enough to really explain the explosion of these particular types of groups. These groups, the Salafi jihadist groups like ISIS, are still very much on the radical extreme within the Muslim world. So then why did so many radical groups emerge in these wars? And there's now we're just in the sort of the nascent phase of research trying to explain them. I wrote an article a year and a half ago called The Extremist Advantage in Civil Wars, and the argument I make there is that there are some real organizational advantages to moving to the ideological extreme, even if you do not believe in the goals, the principles, the ideals of that particular ideology. That's not to say that there aren't true believers. That is not to say that the people who founded ISIS don't to their core want a global caliphate. I think there are clearly true believers that are driving these movements, but it doesn't explain why they've grown. So they're clearly growing because they are attracting the support of Muslim citizens who are less radical for them. And so one of the things we're starting to see is that there are some why moderates might want to support these very extreme groups. What are they? You tend to see more extreme groups emerge in highly competitive environments. So think about it this way. If you want to enter the Syrian civil war in 2013 or 2014, there are at least 4 major rebel groups on the Sunni side. There's hundreds of smaller rebel factions on the Sunni side. It's a very, very crowded field. In the beginning, most of those groups are going after, if you were in American politics, you'd say the median voter, your average Muslim citizen. That's where the most support, or in terms of numbers, is. But if you're coming into the game late, right, one of the things, it's going to be very difficult to compete with the groups who've already built their base. And so one of the things that you do see is late entrants are more likely to go to the ideological extreme. It's kind of a form of product differentiation. They're basically saying, we're different. We're not only different, but we're better. So another thing that you see these groups emerging in countries that have weak political institutions and a history of corruption. So what they're also doing then is they're saying moderates have been corrupt in the past, and they're going to be corrupt again, but we're not going to be corrupt. And you can trust us because we're so extreme in terms of our dictates, in terms of the rules we have for ourselves, for our followers. We have our own system of justice. We are less likely to sell out once we come to power because we really truly believe in these ideals. Anyway, we have a very long discussion about this. If people are interested in the Q&A, I'm happy to go into it more. But one of the things that we're starting to believe is that there are certain conditions when there are very real advantages to embracing a particularly extreme ideology, even if you don't believe it. And you can think about the United States right now, right? There are individuals, our politicians, we have become more polarized. There have been rewards for going more to the ideological extreme on both the right and on the left. And I would argue that some of these conditions exist here in the United States. Okay. I also think there's another reason why Salafi jihadist groups have emerged, and it has to do with the rise of the internet. So the internet, or a Web 2.0 world, emerged starting in the mid-2000s. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we've started to see not only more civil wars, but civil wars with more factions, with more outside intervention, that are more internationalized than we have in the past. And I think the internet is partly responsible for that. What does the internet do? It allows you, it used to be that if you wanted to survive, you had to have a local base of support. That's where you got your soldiers, that's where you got your financing. You could try to go internationally, but it was expensive, it was inefficient, it was hard. Now, anybody, essentially with a smartphone, can link to supporters on a global scale, can link to potential financiers on a global scale. You don't actually even need to have any base of support. And so there's certain groups that are benefiting more than others. And the groups that are benefiting are those with a large global population. Sunnis are particularly lucky in this respect. There are 1.5 billion Sunnis around the world. So it's only a tiny proportion of Sunnis that live in any one of these countries with civil wars. So if you're a Sunni, you have the ability, if you use the internet, you can now recruit foreign soldiers, you can now recruit international aid, and you're much more likely to thrive as a result. Right? Shias don't have this option. Shias essentially exist in any noticeable number in Iran and in Syria. There is no global Shia population. The internet is not going to help Shia groups particularly much. And so you have Sunnis who have this very large global population. The internet also allows not only for you to tap into wealthy international donors, but to have cash transferred in ways that are really difficult to trace. And so the financing becomes easier. But it only becomes easier if you have these wealthy donors out there internationally. And who has these wealthy donors in disproportionate numbers? It's the Sunnis. Persian Gulf countries are Sunni. And then it tends to disproportionately aid extremists. Extremists, right? Why? This is how I think about it. Every single country has a subset of extremists. Radicals exist in every single country around the world. You know, people are born to be more or less radical, or they develop to become more radical, but there's a certain percentage of radicals in every country. They're a very small minority, right? It used to be, it was very hard to find those subsets around the world. It was certainly hard to communicate with them without being detected. The internet allows you to very quickly connect with these individuals, recruit these individuals, and to do it in a way that, again, is difficult to trace and it's difficult to shut down. So moderates, you know, it doesn't help as much. There are large majorities of moderates in every country. It's easier for them to identify each other. It's the extremists that have been able to exploit the internet to their advantage. And so it's no surprise that if you look at who's producing the most internet propaganda, who is most active on social media in terms of radicalization and recruitment, ISIS is number one. They have become absolutely masterful at this particular medium. And I think it's because they understand that it's their lifeline to both supporters and to financing. Okay. So this is important. I want to emphasize that I'm not arguing that ideology and religion don't matter. Again, I really do think that every movement needs true believers to really succeed. They're the individuals who are going to fight harder for you, that are going to remain committed to the cause longer than anybody else. You need these sort of zealots to have any chance of success. All I'm saying is that there could be very good reasons why less radical individuals might also be willing to support these movements. Okay, so then the third question was, well, what do we do about it? This, of course, was the hardest question of all. And my argument, it went back to what I argued in the beginning. You have to address the root causes of civil wars. So civil wars are breaking out in Muslim countries, not because of religion, but because these are really terrible governments. And because countries like Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia are helping to fund these wars. So if you want to end these wars, the U.S. has to remain involved, and it has to be willing to push countries to be serious about real political reform. Saudi Arabia will eventually have a civil war if it doesn't reform and oil money runs out. They will have a civil war because it is a terrible, terrible government. And of course, the United States could incentivize Saudi Arabia to begin that reform process now, rather than waiting until oil money runs out. And the same could be done by incentivizing Russia and Saudi Arabia and Iran to stop funneling money into these conflicts. So I ended by saying if we don't push for reform, if we don't remain involved, then these existing civil wars will continue. Again, Syria is really in its teenage years. It's certainly not middle-aged yet. More civil wars could break out, right? It's not inconceivable that war could break out in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey and Egypt. If that happens, we'll have a situation that's much worse than the situation we're in right now. In fact, if that happens, we're going to look back on 2019 or any of these previous years and say that we actually had it pretty good now. And so it really becomes imperative what the United States does in this region. So what we should be thinking about that we're not thinking about is how to end civil wars, not how to defeat ISIS. So that's all that I said. General Austin had been quiet this entire time, and so I was wondering what he was going to say. And he sat up and all he said was yes. He said yes. And I was like, yes, what does that mean? And then he said, and this really gets to the crux of the problem. He said, now, how do we convince the politicians? So that's it.
Okay, we're going to have some Q&A, and we have a very eager volunteer to bring a mic to you.
Thanks for that great presentation. Typically, what does the research show about how civil wars end? Do they end with one side prevailing or with a negotiated agreement?
So it depends on what time period that you look at. So, go to the beginning. Okay. So during the post-World War II era until about 1992, about 80% of those civil wars ended in decisive victory for one side or the other. It wasn't actually, you'd be surprised at how frequently the rebels actually win. The rebels win about 35 to 40% of the time, so this is not a hopeless venture that they're on. 20% of those wars ended in negotiated settlements. So this was really, really striking, because if you look at interstate wars, the way they're resolved is completely opposite. About 80% of them end in negotiated settlement, 20% end in decisive victory. So it's actually very rare for interstate wars to be fought to sort of a military conclusion. At some point in the war, the two states basically look at each other and say, okay, now's the time to settle. That didn't happen in civil wars. During this period of time, it became quite different. It was a majority of them were ending in negotiated settlements. A minority were going to a decisive conclusion. So people were really curious about that. Why were we suddenly getting so many negotiated settlements? That's an important question to understand. And there were two reasons during this time. One, the Cold War had just ended, and proxy funding from the United States and the Soviet Union that was funneling into these wars dried up. And as soon as the money dried up, there were suddenly incentives for the combatants to negotiate. The Contras in Nicaragua are a perfect example of this. The Contras were not particularly popular locally, but they were very popular with the Reagan administration. And the Reagan administration was essentially funneling money to the Contras unconditionally. And then in the late 80s, when the Cold War was sort of starting to wrap up, Congress basically refused to continue funneling the Contras. And within a few months, the Contras were suddenly quite willing to negotiate a settlement, and within a few months after that, the war ended. So you could really see a direct correlation between money financing these wars and an unwillingness to consider a compromise settlement. The second thing that happened was you suddenly had a more activist UN peacekeeping or Security Council. In order for UN peacekeepers to be sent, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council had to be in agreement to send peacekeepers. Now, the United States and the Soviet Union were both 2 of those 5 permanent members, and they never agreed. They had no interest in having a compromise settlement in Cambodia, for example. They each wanted their preferred side to win. Once the Cold War was over, suddenly Russia and the United States and China and France and Great Britain were in agreement about when and where peacekeepers could be sent. You had more peacekeepers being sent to these countries that were now negotiating settlements, and you had successful settlements. That then started to shift in the early 2000s with the rise of, first with the Iraq War, with the US invasion of Iraq, and then with the Arab Spring, and then you had, instead of the US and the Soviet Union funneling money in, you had Iran and Saudi Arabia funneling in. So it's almost like we're in, a second version of Cold War proxy civil wars. It just happens to be in a different region and between two different regional powers.
You mentioned no civil war in Saudi Arabia. My son, who's now a colonel in the Army, ran the hospital remember when Khobar Towers were bombed? They built a military base 50 miles in the middle of the desert. He ran that hospital for a year. During that time, in the early days, you could go around fairly easily. By the end of his tour, you had to go in groups. You couldn't wear your uniform. And now, I read an article just recently, last week or early this week, that oil production is declining, which means less income, which means less payout to keep the peace, which means civil war is inevitable.
Unless they're willing to institute political reform. And you have seen some baby steps, right? Allowing women to drive. So this is a direct result of the leadership understanding that as their reserves decline, as oil prices remain low, as alternative energy sources are developed, and Western dependence on Middle Eastern oil declines, that they won't have the money to continue to pay off their population. They will have to begin political reform, and these are their sort of halting baby steps. They were going to have to do a whole lot more than that. Now, usually what happens in these situations is before governments like the House of Saud institute major reform, they try repression. They try to repress more and repress more and repress more and repress more. And of course, this is effective until it's not effective, right? It's effective until something triggers an explosion, food shortages, or some economic crisis, or something else that brings the people out in the streets. So my prediction will be that these babies, so they're not going to do a whole lot more than these baby steps. They're going to increasingly try to repress their population. And that's a bad path to go down because it's not a permanent solution. It could. And again, what American presidents have been doing is essentially kicking that can down the road. And Obama was equally, willing to do that. He was willing at least to publicly maybe criticize the Saudi government, but U.S. policy didn't change significantly. So every U.S. president is basically praying that they can hold it together, a little bit longer, and none of them have been willing to put significant pressure for them to significantly reform.
Thank you for your presentation. I feel I understand things a lot better now. All these civil wars require constant inputs of arms. Do you have an idea where the majority of the arms are coming from? And is it the black market or is it the countries? And do the countries have a vested interest in maintaining the instability?
Yeah. So I don't study this. I can tell you most of it is not on the black market. You can purchase this from almost every government. The United States is a big supplier of arms. The Israelis are a big supplier of arms. The French, the British. It's a lucrative business, and arms manufacturers are very eager to provide these profitable products. Where you do see an illicit trade in arms that seems to have an effect is in isolated regions, really poor regions. The wars that break out in countries like Liberia or Sierra Leone, there's usually, they don't have the money to purchase a lot of arms, and so they are getting it through the black market, or, it's being, they're going in neighboring countries that have had civil wars, they're gathering weapons and things like that. But the main source of weapons is wealthy Western democracies.
Just only have time for one more, and then you guys can ask some more. Yeah.
Okay, excuse me.
Well, and I'm sorry, and Russia. And Russia, and there's lots of other people who are implicated. The Russians are really, really bad as well. But,
Chinese?
oh, the Chinese, again, I'd have to look at the data. I'm sure the Chinese would be equally willing to supply it. So there's really two motives. There's the financial motive, and that drives a lot of the Western democracies. And then there's the where you actually want to influence the outcome of the war. The Russians are clearly interested in that. The United States also, to a certain degree. We've been supplying the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Pakistanis with lots and lots and lots of military weapons, the Taiwanese. And we're doing that for strategic reasons. There's different motives.
Okay, so with the election today in Israel, or the final results today,
I don't even know the outcome. What's the outcome?
the Netanyahu's party came out one seat on top, and so with that coming and his recent promise to annex West Bank settlements, and stuff like that, with regards to what you're talking about bordering states, especially in Jordan and Lebanon, what is your take on that situation?
So, one of the amazing things is that there hasn't been a civil war in Jordan and Lebanon. And the reason you haven't is because the Israelis, they will never ever advertise this, and the United States together have been doing an enormous amount of stuff behind the scenes to stabilize those countries. In the absence of heavy Israeli intervention and aid, in Jordan, for example, that probably would have unraveled. Now, the Israelis don't want to advertise this because the Jordanians don't want to advertise this. No Arab country wants the other Arab countries to know that they're dependent on Israel. That's okay with Israel. Israel just doesn't want a civil war in Jordan and Lebanon for its own security. That doesn't worry me. I actually think they're doing the United States and Israel are doing very good jobs stabilizing those two countries. What worries me is a third intifada. I think, Israel is actually probably more at risk of, I call it an intifada, not a civil war, because probably deaths will not be high enough to be labeled a civil war, but it will be like a civil war. And I think everything Netanyahu is doing is leading in that direction in his own country.